Honored to be here with you. I was telling Jeff that this is a little bit nostalgic for me. I used to work here, not in this building, but worked in Las Vegas and spent time here. It's been a while since we've been back. We left in '99 and have been in Utah since. But it was interesting to hear your discussion earlier. We're all facing the same predicaments, and it's interesting. I was reminded that the difference between a problem and a predicament. I had a colorful example. They said, you know, if you're standing on the ledge of a 300-foot cliff and there's water below you, and you're hanging on the edge of the cliff by your fingernails, and you've got a few friends on the cliff, that's a problem. If you're already 20 feet out off the edge of the cliff, and your friends are still standing on the edge, that's a predicament. And it's interesting to look at where we're at right now, and are we at the point of a problem? Are we at a predicament? And I think some of the discussions that you've had and we have in our state, and I've been around many of the western states. I just came back from D.C. I was meeting with many of our members of Congress, and you can see in their face that it's a predicament. We have a federal government that just clipped $16 trillion in official debt. The overspending, the annual overspending is $1.5 trillion a year, and that's just the official debt. If we had the slides up, I'd show you, but we'll get there if we can. If not, we'll just go, and I can send the slides to you later. Okay. Oh, okay. Well, here, try that. We'll probably cover it without it, but if we can get there. It's in, there's a folder on this one that says Nevada Association of Counties, and then there's a thing in there, and we'll see what we get on that. But, I mean, just a couple of months ago, the USA Today published an article that said, the official overspend is $1.5 trillion. If they did their books the way we do in our counties and our states and our businesses, the actual overspend on all of the liabilities, just the annual overspend, is $5 trillion a year. You've got $3.8 trillion in spending, $2.3 trillion in revenue, and then you're booking the promises made to 10,000 baby boomers a day that are retiring that there's no money there. So, I mean, this is serious. Erskine Bowles was the Clinton White House chief of staff, and Alan Simpson, a former senator from Wyoming. President Obama appointed them as the co-chairs of the Fiscal Responsibility Commission to study what happened in 2008, the meltdown, and what happened and where we go from here. And testifying to Congress nearly 18 months ago, well, actually 18 months ago now, Erskine Bowles, testifying to the Senate Budget Committee, said, we may not have seen the last crisis until it was right upon us. He said, but the next one is really easy to see. He said, we face the most predictable economic crisis in history. He said, let me tell you how crazy it is. He said, we have a treaty obligation that if China were to attack Taiwan, we're supposed to defend Taiwan. The only problem is we have to borrow the money from China to defend Taiwan. Right? And then Alan Simpson, in Alan Simpson fashion, he just said, people in America know how crazy this is. They know that if you spend $1 and borrow 40 cents of it, you must be stupid. And he says they've got it figured out. This government is stupid. I was just with Congressman Jim Jordan on Friday, and he just said, I mean, you could see it in his face. He just said, if you're not frightened right now, there's something wrong with you. This is tremendously serious. I mean, 75% of the overspend last year. China's not buying our debt anymore. They're net selling. Japan can't. They're net selling. Those were our two biggest creditors. Right now, the way we're making up that deficit spend is the Federal Reserve is simply printing money. They call it Operation Twist and quantitative easing. History tells us that ends badly. Common sense tells us that ends badly. And so what that means for us at the state and the county level is we're still going to have to take care of our sick people and our poor people and educate our children and provide for public safety regardless of what happens. And I mean, I'm honored to spend this time with you because I take this as a very serious responsibility that we have. Going forward, we're going to have the privilege of governing and not playing government anymore. This is historic, the things that we're in. And so that kind of leads me to why there's so much more on that background that we can talk about, and you know, given time we will. But that's just some of the backdrop of where we're at. In Utah, 40% of our state budget comes from that federal government that's broke. I was just looking at the most recent Clifton Larson Allen report, and I can make that available to you if you'd like. And your prior speaker made these points very effectively. But in the latest Clifton Larson Allen report, Nevada is nearly 50% reliant on that same federal government that is broke for your state budget. So as the cuts come, after the After the warning that Erskine Bowles gave in March of 2011, you would think that Congress would have heeded that warning and got very, very busy about doing something. Well, we had the meltdown discussions in August of 2011, and it wasn't a partisan thing. It's just a meltdown. I mean, this is a government by gimmick that's going on at a level that we've consolidated things beyond its rational capacity to act. They pointed their fingers at each other and then said, let's have a super committee. And if the super committee can't cut $1.2 trillion over 10 years. Now, mind you, we're overspending $1.5 trillion a year. But if they can't cut $1.2 trillion over 10 years, then we're going to have sequestration. We've been hearing that word, right? Automatic cuts, 9% cut to federal discretionary, 10% cut to military. Those begin January 1 of 2013. That's federal law. That's coming at us. Now, they may try to print more money and push the can down the road a little bit more, but that's coming at us. That's coming at the counties. It's coming at the states. We've got to do something about it. Well, as President Reagan said, there are no easy answers, but there are simple ones. And the simple ones are, do you have your little card there now? If you look on that map, I got 4 questions for you that we'll just take a little bit of your time on that. But if you look at that card, the first question, you're probably already thinking it, you know, because Nevada, it's funny when I show that card, around the nation, everybody goes, look at Nevada. Look at Nevada. First question that comes to people's mind that we ask people is why? Why the difference? And it's kind of funny, the answers that come out, actually. When you ask someone you really want an answer and you ask them why the difference, it's really amusing, and I'll talk about some of the answers that come out. But here's what's amazing. The promise at statehood, your Enabling Act, our Enabling Act, you guys were Nevada was admitted as a state in 1864. The language of your Enabling Act says the people of the state forever disclaim all right and title, not jurisdiction, but all right and title to the unappropriated public lands. And many people act as if there's a big period right there. That's only half the sentence. The rest of the sentence reads, until title thereto shall have been extinguished, those lands are subject to disposition by the United States. And if you look at that same language, that's the same language in the Enabling Act of North Dakota and South Dakota and Oklahoma and Nebraska and Louisiana and Mississippi. And the Supreme Court has said other states that have very similar language in their Enabling Acts, it's different, but it's related. The Supreme Court has said repeatedly, it means the same thing. So the promises on both sides of that map are the same. Why the difference? Why the difference? There came a time when the western states got completely fed up with that. You know this history well, I think. They got fed up with that and said, you got to keep your promise. They got together, they banded together and sent resolution after resolution, delegation to Congress and said, why aren't you keeping your promise? We can't tax the land to educate our children. We can't grow our economies and provide good paying jobs, and you're hoarding all of our abundant resources and minerals, right? Does that sound familiar? That was in 1828. In 1828, the western states, by their own description, they called themselves the western states, were Indiana and Illinois, Missouri, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. Florida said, we're worse off than all the western states. Illinois, the federal government had controlled 90%, like Nevada, 90% of their land for decades. Missouri, they had controlled 90% of their land for decades. But they got together and said, you have to keep your promise. You know, that was back when men were men and states were states. And they said, you will keep your promise and all that implies. And they did. Look at the map. 3 to 4% federally controlled lands east of Colorado. Why? That's your second why question. Why did they succeed? Why were they successful in compelling the federal government to keep the same promise that they've made to us but have failed to keep? Isn't that an important question, don't you think? This has already been done. So it's funny the newspapers want to say, oh, you're doing something radical. No. We're simply following the example of states that had the same problem. And by the way, on the website, and I wish we had some of the materials and whatnot, but it's okay, it doesn't matter necessarily. On the website, there's a resources tab. And there are videos and there are documents and all sorts of things that go through this history. In fact, you'll see on the front of the website, it says, Congress and the western states make our case. And so the Public Lands Committee, the Congressional Public Lands Committee, in 1828 said if these lands are withheld from the states, which are the effect of the present system, In vain may those people expect the benefits of well-settled neighborhoods so essential to the education of their youth. When these states agreed not to tax the lands until they were disposed, they rested upon the implied engagement to cause them to be sold within a reasonable time. They said no just equivalent has been given those states for the surrender of an attribute of sovereignty so essential to their welfare and an equal standing with the other states. In fact, they said a remedy for this great evil, I completely agree with Congress for once, right? A remedy for this great evil is found in simply carrying into effect the spirit of the Constitution that knows no inequality in the rights or powers of the several states. That was in 1828. That was Congress in 1820. It's all on the website, so you can go there and look at that. But, yeah, I don't know if he was still there, but Andrew Jackson, and by the way, Andrew Jackson was the president at the time. And this is fascinating. I don't know how much time we have, but this is really critical. There's, on that resources tab, there's a veto statement by Andrew Jackson. He's president in 1833. Andrew Jackson was born in 1767. By 1787, when Article 4, the property clause of the Constitution, when that was drafted, Andrew Jackson wasn't a 20-year-old in the basement playing video games. He was a 20-year-old lawyer in Tennessee. Tennessee was one of these states like us that was yet to be a state. So he was intensely interested in what's the process of creating new states, how does that work? Andrew Jackson spent his whole military career in Orleans and in all that territory that was yet to be states. And so when Andrew Jackson drafts the veto statement in 1833 that you'll read on the resources tab, although he cites all of the documents going back from 1780 forward and the solemn covenants that the federal government was only to hold land for two purposes: create new states, use the proceeds to pay the public debt. I mean, if you think about it, they're in the middle of a war in 1780, right? 1776, they had declared independence. Robert Morris funded the first 3 years of the Revolution by himself, $2 million, lives, fortune, sacred honor. He was tapped out by 1780. They said, what do we do now? How do we fund this war that we're in the middle of? And they said, okay, we've got to do revenue enhancements like you've all been talking about this morning. We have to increase revenue somehow. And of the 13 now states having declared independence, 7 of them in their colonial charters in 1763 from the king, in their colonial charters, the king said, here's your boundary to your colonies. And by the way, 7 of you can have claims to the western wastelands, out to the West Sea, which was the Mississippi River. 7 of you can have claim to the western wasteland. But of the 7, 6 of them got nothing, right? They just got their boundary of their colony. But of the 7, even their claims overlapped. And so there was some dispute about, no, this is mine, no, it's mine. And by 1780, they're trying to figure out how to fund the war. And the 6 of the states said, we got to raise taxes. And the 7 said, hey, no sweat. We'll just sell some of this western land that we have claims to. And the 6 said, hey, wait a minute. We're putting our blood and treasure into this deal as well. We're going to come through this, and you're going to have these great big tracts of land, and we're going to have to raise taxes, and all of our people are going to flee our state and go to you. That doesn't work. And in fact, in the middle of the Revolutionary War, they were almost to the point of a civil war. They call it the Great Embarrassment. And so in September of 1780, the Continental Congress said, here's what we'll do. We'll hold the land. We'll hold these western lands to make new states and use the proceeds to pay the debt. And they came up with a resolution that the states looked at it and said, no, you got to do better than that. If we're talking about something as serious as you holding title as a centralized power, think of who they were, as a centralized power, you holding title to land, if we're talking about something that serious, it has to be very, very specific. And so they went back and tried it again, and on October 10th of 1780, they drafted another resolution that said the unappropriated public lands, that's the language still used in our enabling acts, right? The unappropriated public lands that may be relinquished or ceded to the United States by the states shall be disposed of for the common benefit and only to create distinct republican states with the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, and independence as all the other states. And they'll be disposed of on such regulations as Congress may prescribe for disposing of the land. Pretty clear, right? On that basis, New York said, okay, fine, we'll cede our land to you. And when they did it, though, they said, we'll cede the land to you only to create new states, use the proceeds to pay the public debt, and for no other use or purpose whatsoever. That was their exact language. And the other 7 states began to cede their claims to the United States. Actually, it was the Confederacy at that point, right? Now, 3 of them didn't cede their claims until after the Constitution. Georgia didn't cede its claims until 1802. Some people say, oh, that's just old stuff, Representative Ivory. What are you talking about? That's just old stuff. That doesn't matter. No, Georgia ceded its lands after the Constitution in 1802. And they said the same thing. We're only going to cede our claims to these western lands to you, create new states, use the proceeds to pay the debt, no other use or purpose whatsoever. 1784, Jefferson drafts a land ordinance that says the same thing. Only regulations for disposing of the land, equal footing, create new Republican states. 1787, the Northwest Ordinance, this is all on the website. Northwest Ordinance says the same thing. The states will all be on an equal footing. And the states won't interfere in any way with the federal government's primary disposal duty to dispose of that land to create new states, use the proceeds to pay the debt. And the regulations will only be for disposing of the land. Then we get to Article 4, Section 3, which is the constitutional power on which these lands are managed, on which territorial lands are managed. And Article 4, Section 3, in the constitutional debate, there was 1 page of constitutional debate on this section. And they said, this section, Article 4, Section 3, is simply to preserve the status quo going back to 1780, in fact, back to 1763. They'd already had this great embarrassment that they were working over and said, we're just going to preserve that status quo. And so they drafted Article 4, Section 3 to preserve the status quo. It says, Congress shall have the power to dispose of and make needful rules and regulations regarding the territory. And nothing in the Constitution shall be construed to prejudice any of the claims that the United States or the states shall have under the Constitution. Think about that. You now know more than most lawyers know about Article 4, Section 3, because you don't teach that in law school. In law school, they say Article 4, Section 3 means the federal government can do anything it wants. Does that make any sense? When you look at that simple map, and you look at that manifest disparity, manifest injustice, and you realize that it's already been done before and that the promises are the same, kind of important that we understand what that means. More information on the website. But anyway, getting back to 1833 then. By 1833, they had paid off the debt from the war. How would that be? And so Henry Clay was a senator from Kentucky. And Henry Clay said, okay, we paid off the debt. We know we need to dispose of the land. That's indisputable. In fact, he called it the Great National Public Trust in the debate on the Senate floor. The Great National Public Trust, and it was done as a trust because that's the utmost good faith and loyalty. The highest duty known in law was a trust duty. He said it was a trust because if the federal government didn't keep its obligation to dispose of the land, there'd be no other remedy but a breach of the peace, back when states were states and men were men. He made that statement on the floor of the Senate. But what they said was because the debt was paid off, we'll take the money from disposing of the land, as we're bound to do, and we'll use that money as a slush fund. And when the states and counties do what we want, we'll give them some money. Does that sound familiar? And so it passed the House and the Senate, and it goes to President Jackson, who was born in 1767 and knew a thing or two about this whole history. And President Jackson said, you don't understand. These solemn compacts made in 1780 that created this trust where the federal government only held the land as a trustee to create new states and use the proceeds to pay the public debt, that was the very basis on which our nation was made. It solved the great embarrassment, and without that trust arrangement, we never would have had a constitution in the first place. And so he vetoed the bill. And in vetoing the bill, he made a statement that he said, these lands, the price of these lands shall be reduced and graduated, and after they've been offered for a certain number of years, the refuse remaining unsold shall be abandoned to the states, and the machinery of our land system entirely withdrawn. You've got to read that. It's on the resources tab. It's phenomenal. It's about 8 pages. He gives the best, contemporaneous, most concise history of what our public land history is. That's why they succeeded in the 1820s and 30s, those great western states of Illinois and Missouri and Louisiana and Florida. The reason they were successful in getting the federal government to honor its promise to them was because they knew that history, and they knew their legal rights, and they banded together. And they simply refused to take no for an answer, whatever it takes. You have to dispose of our land because we can't educate our children, as you've all been talking about. You have to dispose of the land because we can't provide good-paying jobs and grow our economy, as you've all been talking about. We can't access our resources that we've been so abundantly blessed with and develop them in a responsible fashion because you're not keeping your promise. And because they refused to take no for an answer, and in every meaningful contact they had with Washington, they said, when are you going to keep your promise for our kids? When are you going to keep your promise so that people don't leave our state? When are you going to keep your promise so that we can provide good paying jobs and access our abundant resources that we've been blessed with? And you can see that they succeeded. They compelled Congress to treat them as governing partners, and they ended up with what was called the Graduated Price Act of 1854, where they reduced the price, and ultimately would just give the land to the states. To Tennessee and to Hawaii, they just gave the land to the states outright. To Michigan, they started disposing of the land, and they just gave them 13 million acres and said, you dispose of it. We don't want to keep managing things up here. And they did. So what we did in Utah, based on that history, we passed a bill called House Bill 148, my bill, Transfer of Public Lands Act. You've all gone down that road, and some people say, well, we've already charged this hill. We've already charged this hill. Why go there again? Well, there's some very substantial differences. Number one, we've never been in this economic situation before in the history of the world. We've never been here before. And at this time, because of that economic situation, this isn't just rural folks. This isn't just cowboys and ranchers coming in and saying, hey, you've got a sagebrush rebellion, they called it. Our teachers' associations were on board as we move forward on this bill. Our PTA, our school board, were supportive as we move forward on this legislation. Our Association of Counties, the National Association of Counties, has already done a resolution in support of this effort. So many others. Our access and open space groups were supportive. One of the things that we did in our bill that I think made a substantial difference. Well, let me just describe the bill. First of all, the fundamental basis for the legislation is based on a Supreme Court case, unanimous Supreme Court case from 2009. The case is called Hawaii versus the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. 2009, unanimous U.S. Supreme Court. In that case, let me take you back to 1893. In 1893, you had the Royal Hawaiians and the Native Hawaiians owning and governing the land in Hawaii, and industrial powers came in and overthrew them and took the land, seized the land and gave it to the federal government. Native Hawaiians were not happy. And they carped and griped and complained. And in 1959, when Hawaii was made a state, the federal government said, here, take all your land. Now, there had been an office established called the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. And the Office of Hawaiian Affairs looked out for the complaints that were still there from the Native Hawaiians. So Hawaii's made a state, and they say, take all your land. Well, in 1993, 100 years from overthrowing the Royal Hawaiians and the Native Hawaiian government and taking their land, Senator Inouye runs an apology resolution in Congress. And the apology resolution goes something like this. Whereas, now therefore, we apologize to the Native Hawaiians for what happened 100 years ago, and nothing in this resolution will deny or disparage any claims that the Native Hawaiians have against the federal government. Right? 1993. Fast forward a few years. Now the Hawaiian state government says, we're going to sell some of this land that was granted to us under our solemn compact, our solemn covenant, our sovereign act of statehood. We're going to take some of these lands and we're going to sell it. Office of Hawaiian Affairs comes in and says, hey, based on this subsequent act of Congress, you have to impress a lien on that land. You can't just sell it without putting a lien on that for the Native Hawaiians. And the state of Hawaii said, what are you talking about? Some subsequent act of Congress trying to change our sovereign act of statehood? And they go to Hawaii District Court, and the Hawaii District Court said, you've got no claim. They go to the Hawaii Supreme Court, and the Hawaii Supreme Court sided with the Native Hawaiians, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and said, you have to impress a lien upon all that land granted at statehood based on this subsequent act of Congress. Goes to the United States Supreme Court on that basis. The United States Supreme Court makes this statement in their holding. The consequences of a state's admission are instantaneous. And it ignores the uniquely sovereign character of that event to even suggest that somehow subsequent acts of Congress can diminish what was already bestowed at statehood. And then they said this proposition applies with even greater force where virtually all of a state's public lands are at stake. Think of what they said just a couple of years ago unanimously. Congress cannot enact some policy or legislation that unilaterally changes that sovereign act and commitment of statehood. Now, there are a number of other cases on the website. There are a number of other things out there. There are cases recent cases where the Supreme Court had actually cases subsequent to litigation that you had from actions that were taken in Nevada years ago, where they said that enabling acts are solemn compacts. They're bilateral agreements to be performed in a timely fashion. Well, what does that mean? A solemn compact is obviously something more than a run-to-the-mill contract. Again, it's an act of statehood, a uniquely sovereign character of statehood. So based on that, as a state, we set a deadline. I like to tell a little story about my daughter. She's up in college, up at Utah State. And she came home and she says, Dad, I got a problem. I buy food, I put it in the refrigerator, and my roommates eat it. And I buy more food, I put my name all over it, I put it in the refrigerator, and my roommates eat it. She says, what do I do? I said, well, honey, you got two choices to make. You can keep buying food and put it in the refrigerator, and your roommates will eat it. Or you can sit down with them and have a really difficult conversation about what it means to be a partnership, what it means to be roommates in this system. What HB 148 does is we set a deadline, as we do when we have difficult things that we need to address, rather than letting delay, as we've been dealing with so often. You fall back and delay and fall back and delay and fall back and delay becomes a tactic for one partner in a partnership that's out of balance. We said, no, there's a deadline. Now, we set a reasonable deadline of December 31st of 2014, that by that date, we want to work with you, our federal governing partner, that you'll keep your promise, the same promise you already kept with all the states east of Colorado, the very same promise. We want to work with you on an orderly transfer so that we work this out in a manner that respects grazing and mining and open space and access and all of these rights on the land that have accrued over the 100-plus years of our statehood, and not just throw those to the wind. That was something that in the Sagebrush Rebellion was maybe not as addressed perhaps as carefully. But we preserve those rights and carry those over status quo like they did in granting the land to Tennessee and Hawaii and Michigan. And then the lands are managed by Utah in a Utah Public Lands Commission by Utahns, for Utahns, and for our guests from around the world. And we set up a Public Lands Commission to do what was promised in the Federal Land Policy Management Act, but that was also failed. Federal Land Policy Management Act, right? After that 200 years of sacred trust history where the federal government only holds the land as a trustee to create new states, use the proceeds to pay the debt, not until 1976 did Congress unilaterally, on its own, without dealing with the states. By the way, in our enabling acts, it says this is an act irrevocable without the consent of Congress and the people. It says that right in the Enabling Act. Not until 1976 does Congress, with FLIPMA, say it's now our policy to retain these lands in federal ownership. You've got a policy versus a uniquely sovereign act. A policy versus a solemn covenant. A policy versus a sacred trust, the Supreme Court has called it. That question's never gone to the Supreme Court. Our Attorney General's office has been doing research all over. This has never gone to the Supreme Court. Can Congress, on its own, unilaterally, just change those solemn terms of that sovereign act of statehood? Now, we think the arguments on that, with all of the cases that go back, is clearly no. Clearly no. What's the remedy then? The remedy is more challenging. You can't simply go in and say, here's my bill for 140 years that you've not allowed us to tax the land to educate our children, that you've not allowed us to have the economic multiplier effect and unleash the ingenuity of Nevadans to develop our land responsibly. Let me go back. I'm sorry. I'm going to go into so many tangents here. Let me go back to the four myths, right? The four reasons why we can't do this. They're kind of funny if you think about them. But the first one is, you gave up your land. You didn't want all that timber. You didn't want all that gold that you have, all the minerals that you have. You didn't want that. You just didn't want it. You gave it up. Because in your Enabling Act, it says right there, forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands, period, as if there were one, but there's not. And they don't read the rest of the sentence that says, until title thereto shall be extinguished. And they don't bother to look east of Colorado and all the states east of Colorado that have word for word the same language in their Enabling Acts. But they make that statement, you gave up your land. The second myth is, you can't manage your own lands. Now, Arkansas and Missouri, they can, but Nevada. That's the argument. You can't manage your own land. God, if you manage your own land, you might manage it for maximum combustion and have 1,000 trees per acre in your forest and burn them down. Where did I hear that? You know? You can't manage your own lands. Really? We just had a hearing in our Natural Resources Committee last week with our state land managers, our forester, our school trust lands, and others. They said, of course we can. Think about it. Just think the low-hanging fruit. Just imagine that you get 100% of your mineral lease royalty instead of 46 or 47%. Just imagine that you could control access to your lands and get 100% of your mineral lease royalty instead of 46 or 47%. Hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of dollars right there. Just in that alone. North Dakota was actually made a state after Nevada. North Dakota and Utah were made states at about the same time. 5 years apart, the Enabling Acts. Word for word identical. North Dakota's got 20,000 jobs just looking for people. North Dakota just put $1.2 billion into school building infrastructure. They were already at the national average in per pupil funding. They just added $3,700 per pupil above the national average in per pupil funding. Utah, we're $3,700 below the national average. It would take us $2.2 billion to get to average. Take us another $2.2 billion to catch up with our neighbor in North Dakota. Some people say, oh, you just need to try harder and tax more. Well, you've had that discussion this morning. That would be doubling income tax, assuming you don't kill the economy. It would be raising corporate taxes by 1,000%, assuming you don't kill the economy. Illinois and California have tried that, and we see the results. Why the difference? Why does it matter? Certainly, education equality is one big reason. Rob Bishop does a great job. This is also on the website. Congressman Rob Bishop will point out that the states that have the hardest time raising education dollars, where all the red is on the map, documented. The states that have the hardest time funding education, all those states in red. Some of our counties, some of your counties have less than 5% taxable land. That leads us to the third myth, right? The third myth is, well, this land belongs to all of us. Like, okay, well, let me know, commissioners, when we can start sending tax notices to Central Park East. And all of us can pay for police and fire and sanitation and education. If it belongs to all of us should be carrying the burden. If it belongs to all of us, why the arbitrary line when the promises are the same? Why doesn't Oklahoma belong to all of us and yet Nevada belongs to not Nevadans? You control so much less of Nevada than the BLM and the Forest Service does. Goes into Republican form of government in the Constitution that we can speak about at another time. But if it belongs to all of us and the promises are the same, either they need to give theirs back or they got to keep their promise. The last myth that people will bring up is, well, this is clearly unconstitutional. It's just clearly unconstitutional, no debate. Well, aren't you quite the Supreme Court of one? Because the Supreme Court has said Congress does not have, recently, unanimously just said Congress doesn't have the authority to change those uniquely sovereign acts at statehood. The uniquely sovereign acts at statehood, the same as ours, as the states east of Colorado, say you have to dispose of the land. If you go back to the history on Article 4, Section 3, the authority of Congress was only to dispose of the land and make regulations for disposing of the land. And we could talk about all the ways you have to really twist the Constitution to get to the point that Article 4 gives Congress the supreme power over everything. It simply doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense practically. It certainly doesn't make sense legally.
Ken, we're 30 minutes into it. I know you're getting tired of talking. Can you wrap it up here so we got time to ask questions?
Certainly. A couple of things that education equality is certainly a big reason. Environmental quality is a tremendous reason. Right now in our forests, we're seeing 1,000 trees to an acre. A healthy forest is 40 or 50. We're seeing forests burn down, and not just the resource, the renewable resource being lost, you're losing the watershed for generations. I just drove from Show Low through Payson down to Phoenix, and from the Rodeo Chittister fire, it still looks like a bomb hit it. The watershed is completely wiped out. And on the heels of fires, you get floods that wash everything out. But even more significantly, in our committee hearing last week, I was asking our state forester that I had heard rumors that Al-Qaeda was aware of this fuel load. And he says, oh yeah. In fact, I've got a document back here I'll share with you. FBI, Department of Homeland Security, was sending notices out, your state forester probably has one, sending notices out to the state foresters that in the Al-Qaeda network, they're publishing throughout their network that, look, they've already given us the fuel. And for a few $100s, we can do billions of dollars of intergenerational damage because they've already given us the fuel. There are a lot of reasons why this is important. The economic self-reliance we talked about, I mean, you have resources here that are unbelievable to be able to maintain the economic self-reliance of your state when we're in this tremendous predicament off the edge of the cliff. This is an incredible time. Let me just finish with this one statement that kind of drives me in what we're doing. Ronald Reagan in 1985 made a statement at the height of the Cold War. You know, nuclear proliferation, red phone, we didn't know when things were going to go. And so he made this statement that I think if he were here today, he would direct at you as commissioners who've sworn an oath. He would direct at state representatives. He said, this is a wonderful time to be alive. He said, we're lucky not to live in pale and timid times. We've been blessed with the opportunity to stand for something. For liberty and freedom and fairness, these are things worth fighting for, worth devoting our lives to. So let us go forth with good cheer and stout hearts. Happy warriors out to seize back a country and a world of freedom. Happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. Early on you said something about Congress otherwise and prescribing, you know, but basically you've got a very sound argument presented here today, but I guess the question would be about, you know, Yellowstone was getting developed and whatnot. We've got, I guess just simply round it off quickly, how do you address national parks, forests, Bryce Canyon, or, you know, Rainbow, you know, any of your natural arches, your circle of parks in Utah? Would that?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. We've taken that expressly off the table in our bill. So all of the national parks, national monuments, with the exception of Escalante.
I figured that was a latecomer, yeah.
Yeah, Escalante, that was 2 million acres tied up, $2 trillion worth of coal that was tied up without talking to a single Utahn. That's still in play. All the other national monuments off the table. The congressionally designated wilderness, not the latest round of everything is wilderness, but the congressionally designated wilderness and the national parks off the table. So we protect under the bill an area about the size of West Virginia. We may do more. I mean, as Utahns, we may say, hey, we've got other areas we want to take off the table. But the idea is what FLTMA promised but failed. Multiple use, sustained yield with local planning. And that's, in fact, yesterday we met with, about 25 of our commissioners to start working on the implementation procedures. What does it look like as we move forward? As we start to move forward on taking the actions that secure our rights, how does that local planning go forward? And so we're working the second step of legislation from the bottom up with our county commissioners.
And follow up is, are you going to be, will the state run this, or are you going to turn it to the counties? And I guess when I'm saying that, because small counties, just like you've got them up in Utah, and you got your large areas, populated areas of management resources.
Yeah, and so the discussion that was going on yesterday, which is kind of how we had hoped it would go, you would obviously have your state agencies that are dealing with overall resource regulation, air quality regulation, wildlife regulation. You know, there would be a state catch-all over those broad areas. But the general land planning would happen more on a local level. And what exactly that's going to look like, we're in the process of building that. And in fact, we look forward to working with your counties. We got some ideas in Elko a few weeks ago that you looked at our bill and said, wow, we think the county should have a veto provision on some of this stuff. And we thought, man, that's a great idea. So as we start to work through that process, we're going to get best practices, but we're working on building that right now. But yeah, local control, I mean, that's where land access, land use, land ownership, you already have the mechanism to do that. And so...
Are we still hooked
Ken,
up?
we've been talking about changing our tax structure, increasing sales, lowering the tax on goods, and still we're going to have a problem, you know, being able to operate. Do you have any just rough ideas, rough figures for Utah, for instance, what it might make, the difference it might make for Utah being able to access your minerals?
Yeah, we know that on just the correcting the mineral lease bonus disparity, you know, North Dakota gets 100%, same time as statehood, same promises of statehood. Just that alone is about $500 million, not counting any access. But let's talk about access. You had the Government Accountability Office just 2 months ago testifying to Congress, and they said there's more recoverable oil in Utah, Colorado, Wyoming than the rest of the world combined. We can't even get to it. So you combine access with the 100%, I mean, we're talking billions. We're working right now and trying to sharpen the pencil on that, but, you know, we're moving forward and we don't see that. You have a lot of the groups that come in, and it's kind of insidious, I think, but some of these groups will come in and say, oh, we can't afford to manage our lands. We're like, if you don't even have to sharpen your pencil very sharp. But they'll talk about, look, you're getting $200 million from the federal government to manage these lands. Well, yeah, we're not going to manage our forests to burn down. We're not going to manage our rangelands to burn down. We're going to access even our school trust lands. Right now, they're all checkerboarded. And in many cases, like they did in Elko County, where they came in with the travel management plan, and after you dealt with them and dealt with them and dealt with them, and they just said, here's your plan, and we'll give you one little concession that you can go off the road for half a day to get an elk, even though you're deer territory. That kind of restriction that we're seeing in Utah as well, that costs us hundreds of millions of dollars in even accessing and deploying our state trust lands that we already own. So, yeah, I don't have an exact number, but we are looking in the billions in economic impact.
So if I were a hunter from Las Vegas going to Elko County and hunt, or say I was a hunter from Salt Lake City going south to one of the counties, the Kanab area, for instance, to hunt, am I still going to be able to hunt on the same lands that I hunt on now?
Yeah, exactly right. And so if we were in Utah's case 1896, in Nevada's case 1864, if we were there, the deal was sell off all the land. We're not there. We're 100 years down the road, plus more than 100 years down the road, where we've relied on access and hunting and fishing and grazing and all the rest. To just throw that up in the air is certainly not justified. It's probably illegal at this point. And so all of those rights, we carry those over status quo to the Utah Public Lands Commission and manage that multiple use at the state level. And then go forward. Now, there is provision in the bill that if we were to sell some lands, I mean, imagine you've got a single-purpose piece of land. You've got land in the middle of a ranch. You happen to have a BLM section that's right in the middle of a privately owned ranch or something like that. We make provision, just like you have now. I mean, suppose you have a park or a road as a county and you say, hey, we're not using it anymore. We don't need it. You already have a process in statute where you have two hearings. You have a hearing to vacate the public use and say this is no longer public property. And then you have a second hearing on these are the terms under which we want to sell it. I would imagine there'd be something similar to that, but we don't envision in the bill this large selling of land. But if you've got a city or a county that may be landlocked or hemmed in, those may be areas that it makes more sense to privatize it. But that would be a public open process to get there.
Well, in northern Nevada, when the railroad was built, the railroad was given every other section 20 miles each side of the railroad. And we still have that checkerboard pattern, and it just gives everybody fits. The developers, the ranchers, even the BLM, everybody would like to fix that so that we could block it up. And so I think there are lands, especially there, that everybody would be able to agree should be disposed of.
And to your point, this should not be viewed as a panacea. This is a big lift. It's not going to solve all the problems. You're not going to solve all the problems of access versus private versus development versus conservation versus. We're not going to solve all those problems, but how much better to do them in our backyard than be dictated to? And so, there's still going to be issues where we're going to be dealing with those on a local level, but you get 10 people together and you've got the ability to sway what's happening in your state where in Washington, it takes about $10 million to play, I'm told.
Any other
Madam
questions?
Chair, I have a question for Ken.
Okay, Virgil.
Okay, Ken, in looking at your bill here under provisions, the highlighted provisions on line 39 through 42, provides that if the state transfers title to public lands with respect to which the state receives title to the public lands under the Transfer of Public Lands Act, the state shall retain 5% of the net proceeds the state receives and pay 95% of the net proceeds the state receives to the United States.
Right.
Could you elaborate on that, or
yes, thank you for that question.
Or maybe give an example and the purpose on that?
Yes, thank you for that question. By the way, there's so much that we can't cover just in the time, but there is more information on the website. You've got my card. Please feel free to contact me with any questions. You have great legislators here that are already working on this. I was just on the phone with Crescent Hardy, Ira Hansen, some folks that are running for office, Barbara Sagaski. I'm going to forget a bunch of them, but you have a bunch of them that are already Ellison and but to the question, in our Enabling Act, it provides that under disposal, the federal government's duty is to dispose of the land. That means extinguish title, get rid of it.
Right.
Part of disposing is also selling. And in our Enabling Act and your Enabling Act, it says if you sell as part of disposal, you give 5% of the proceeds to our permanent fund for education. And 95% stays with the federal government to pay the public debt. Well, we honor that promise. Now, I'll tell you personally, I don't like it. I think we should give them some hand gestures and keep all the money. But that's our promise. And so while we're compelling the promise, we're going to honor the promise. And so if we sell land, which could be viewed as a disincentive to sell land, but if we sell land, 5% goes to our permanent fund for education, 95% goes to pay the debt.
So it's a check and balance.
Yeah, you can certainly view it that way.
So if the state of Nevada took back our public lands, and we have those, and let's just, for example, say a mining company comes in and wants to buy a piece of property for mining purposes, obviously, and let's just say, just to throw this number out there, say the state sells it to them for $1 million, and they agree to that. So out of that $1 million, the state would get 5% of that sale price, and then 95% would go to the feds.
Right. That's the proposal that we have in our bill. Now, you would also have the opportunity of, rather than selling the land, you simply lease the land and lease the, so that would be a decision that would be wholly within your state on how you wanted to manage that land going forward. But if you went through the public process and determined to sell it and then the terms, under our bill, what we're proposing is to honor those terms of our Enabling Act, and the education fund would keep $50,000 in your scenario, and the federal government would get $950,000. Now, one thing that's also important to point out, this still, even under that scenario where we don't intend to sell a lot of land in our case, that still benefits the nation. In a situation where we've got this tremendous deficit and debt and unemployment, you free up a resource for jobs. I mean, look at I was just in Elko, and they said it's hard to find places to house people because you've got some things happening up there. Imagine that you've got that throughout your state and our state and New Mexico and Arizona and Idaho. What that does to employment nationally, what that does to GDP nationally, what that does to reducing deficits nationally. When we were in Speaker Boehner's office with his staff and talking about these tremendous math problems, they're not politics problems anymore, they're math problems. And he said, you're right, we can't solve that unless we grow the pie. There's just no way.
So how many taxes from a mining, and DeMar, maybe you can kind of chime in on this a little bit, because I've heard several different answers, and I don't know what to believe. How much of a mining operation, how much of those taxes go to the federal government, tax revenues they generate, aside from the net proceeds that stay in the state? I'm led to believe that all revenues generated from a mining operation in the state of Nevada stay within the state, but I don't believe that. Don't the feds get their share?
I think they do, but I think the important thing here is access to the minerals, and which we don't have now. For instance, the example that we heard about North Dakota being able to drill for oil, and all of the oil that we have, in Elko County, we had 160,000 acres just taken off the table because of the BLM interim management policies for sage grouse that were going to be leased for exploration and now aren't. Now, if that were state land and we could, you know how to go talk to the governor, go talk to your legislators. You know how to get things done in the state, where go to Washington and try to reason with the agencies there, and it's just really uphill. But the difference as far as the economic benefit to the state is being able to have access to those minerals.
Okay, thanks,
Now,
Dima.
Virgil, this is Jerry. Any other questions you have for Mr. Ivory, contact him, dear.
Yes,
Okay.
I will.
We are really running over. We've already lost one commissioner. Mr. Collins?
And he can answer us off if you can email us back.
Sure.
Yes.
What do you do with how do you address the Ted Turners and Bob Redfords and the Endangered Species Act?
How do you address them? That would be your issue, and
No, I
deciding
mean-
whether or not you're going to sell them. And then in terms of the Endangered Species Act and other things, when the property is in state hands, the equal access to justice would no longer apply. And so where there's not a fund to fund lawsuits, they would have to self-fund. And what we've seen in circumstances like that, those lawsuits tend to dry up.
Okay, now then, Mr. Ivory, we appreciate you. We thank you. Keep in touch. People here will be contacting you.
Yeah, a couple of asks, if I could.
Yeah.
Our Utah Association of Counties were tremendous in both shaping the bill, involved in the process of shaping the bill, but then obviously in passing it. They did resolutions in support. National Association of Counties have done resolutions in support. And then this American Lands Council effort is in part, but not whole, it's in part to drive this effort to secure local control of land access, land use, land ownership, and we would welcome your participation, because when I was in Tokyo, I used to work in Japan for the mayor's office of Osaka, and traveling through Tokyo at times, they have those mad scramble intersections where you just go all different ways and you don't quite know what's going on. And I stood there and I asked my friend, I said, how do you cross these things? This seems kind of frightening. And he says, if we all cross together, it's not scary. Just like they did in the 1830s, I would ask that you stand with us and we move forward, because this has already been done before. Thank you for your time.
Ken, thank you. Probably what we will do is have at a future Public Lands Natural Resource Steering Committee agenda item to take action and then bring back before the board as a whole.
And I'd be honored to provide any other information. If you don't see things on the website that you would like, and if you wouldn't mind, if you'd like, if you want to funnel your information perhaps to Commissioner Dahl, we have some regular updates that we send out. And so if you're interested in information, if you'd get your contact information to him, we'd be happy to get you on that list.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.